Okay, wonderful. So welcome everybody. My name is Carolyn Samuel. I'm a Senior Academic Associate at Teaching and Learning Services. I'm co-hosting this webinar with Adam Finkelstein, Associate Director of Teaching and Learning Services. And we have our colleague Jenny Ferris with us, who will be typing some information for you in the chat periodically. But we want to point out that with this number of people, we cannot respond to all your questions, so we're going to ask you to hold on to your questions till the end, and we'll do our best to address them toward the end of the webinar, and Jenny will be keeping track of those. We are recording this webinar, and the recording will be made available to you on the TLS website. We'll try and do that for you tomorrow sometime. And I'm just checking my notes to make sure that we've said everything we wanted to say before we get into the content. And I think we have, so we're pleased to launch our webinar series with planning for remote delivery for fall 2020. We're going to say more later on about the webinar series, but this is the first of, I think, 8 that we're going to be offering throughout the month of June. And we hope you'll join us for the whole series. So, planning for remote delivery for fall 2020. Let me just keep going here. And I'm clicking and nothing is happening. There we go. So we have a couple of session outcomes today. And we're hoping that by the end of this session, you'll be able to define what the remote teaching context means for adapting your courses while respecting desired learning outcomes. That's going to be key. And we're hoping that you'll be able to identify criteria for determining which components of your course should be fixed and which should be flexible, focusing on promoting student engagement. Now, fixed and flexible might be new terms for you. We're going to talk about those today so that everybody has a better sense of what that is. We're going to kick off with a polling activity because we'd like to get a sense of who's joined us today in this webinar and what your experience is with teaching remotely. So this is our polling question, and Adam, I'm going to ask you to to launch the poll. There we go. So everybody should see the Zoom poll on the screen. Responses are already coming in. That's great.
Fantastic. Whoa, look at that thing climb.
Okay, we're getting lots of responses.
Fantastic. Well, it looks interesting, Carolyn, with the real split between there's almost as many people who've taught in the winter as who haven't done it yet but are planning for the fall. That's a really interesting split in the data. Okay,
yeah, and I've got 41 and 45% there. Okay, so that information is helpful for us. When we use tools, we also like to point out what is doable with the tools we're using. So you can see we've just demonstrated a Zoom poll. It's fairly simple to do. There are different polling tools. Subsequent webinars will address different tools that you can use, but we just wanted to point out that this is something that can be done in Zoom. All right, let's keep going then.
Sorry to jump in. This is Jenny. I'm the moderating the chat. So people are wondering if it would be possible for them to see the poll.
To see the poll, yeah.
There it is. So I just shared the results, closed the poll, and sharing the results for everybody to see here.
Thanks, Jenny.
Unfortunately, there's always a button you have to click. And, you know, even though we've done this many times, there's always some button that we forgot to click. So again, thank you for reminding. And I think that's a really good thing to pause on as well, that, you know, we want to be in touch with our students that are in our sessions. And if something's going on, we want to be aware that, hey, they're asking us a question. We did something. We forgot to click a button. And here we are. So thank you.
Okay, let's keep going then. Thanks very much. So we're going to talk a little bit about course design. And we thought this would be a good thing to do because it's going to look familiar to many of you. But you're going to see what's going to change in the upper left-hand corner. Course design, we're going to start with that, but then we're going to look at how we're going to adapt what we know about course design to the remote teaching context. So anybody who has taken the course design workshop at TLS or looked at some of our materials on the web will be familiar with this particular graphic, where we consider the context for our course, And then we want to think about content, which is going to be the important concepts, the important ideas that you will want to bring to your students. And then we have outcomes. Outcomes are what students will know, value, be able to do by the end of your course. And many of you include course learning outcomes in your course outlines, and this is going to be familiar to you, so there's nothing new about this. Assessment: how will you and students know the extent to which outcomes have been achieved? So you want to align your assessments with the outcomes. Again, nothing new there. And then we've got strategies. So what engagement and interaction activities will support learning? So again, we're thinking alignment. What kinds of activities will students do to prepare them for the assessments so that they can achieve the learning outcomes? All of this should be familiar. So what's different when we teach remotely? Well, we've got a different context. We might have to change the assessments, and we might have to change some of our strategies. So that's what our webinars are going to focus on: how we can help you to understand the context, how we can help you adapt the assessment strategies, and how we can help you adapt the engagement and interaction strategies so that students can achieve the learning outcomes in your course. Let's begin with the context, and this is the big one. This is different now. Remote delivery, what's different with that and online learning? Well, there are a few differences. So in our remote delivery context, we're adapting, and we can't repeat that often enough. We are adapting what we did before for a temporary period, in contrast to online learning, which is intended for online delivery right from the start. The adaptation of courses over a relatively brief period with support, that's our context. So we want to help you with adapting your courses. In contrast to online learning, which is where the courses are typically developed over a lengthy period, like 6 to 9 months, with a team of specialists who work exclusively on designing online courses. Back to remote delivery. In this context, we select technology with a focus on what's available and feasible. So we're working with existing McGill tools that are likely familiar to many of you. And that's in contrast to online learning, where one might avail oneself of many, many other tools that are available that may not be familiar to us at this time. But we're going to stick with what we know. And then finally, students didn't enroll They didn't enroll to learn remotely necessarily, in contrast to online learning, where students had an expectation of learning online. So an important takeaway, we're talking about adapting, we're talking about something that's temporary. And I think now I'm going to turn it over to Adam. We had looked just now at context, big picture. Adam, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we're going to look at context, but now narrowing the focus to individual courses.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Carolyn. And I think, this transition is a complex one for everyone. And I think that, Carolyn, reiterating what Carolyn said, that no one chose remote delivery. This is something that we're all doing. We didn't necessarily sign up for it, but here we are. And it's something that we need to make the really good choices to make sure that our context is taken into account. So the first one is a context that we already know a lot about. So for example, if we continue forward, Carolyn, with the animation there, the course context is really talking about size, level, and required, whether versus elective or the policies that are involved. Those are really the critical things that we need to think about to be able to make sure that we're aware of how we're adjusting our course design and what we're doing in order to make sure of that. So sort of and keep advancing there, Carolyn, on the slide. So the next thing we have to keep thinking about is concerns about the student. So if we advance for the student bullets, we really have to be aware that our context for students is slightly different. The background of the student is always important, what they knew about before they came into the course. We have all sorts of interesting issues that, we may have ended the courses in winter where some things got missed or some things didn't happen. And in the fall, there may be some review they need to do. These are really important things to keep aware of. Time zones. I mean, it's really great to say we're going to have class 3 times a week at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But what about students in China that are connecting that happen to be in the middle of the night? Are we expecting them to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning or whatever it might be to attend in the middle of the night? Again, things we have to be aware of. The next one, internet service and bandwidth. Most people have really good internet connections, but those of you like myself, we're sharing those internet connections with our families, and our families might also be in remote situations where you've got your kids watching Netflix or another sibling watching Netflix, you've got another person on a Zoom call, and our overall bandwidth in our houses is really going to be a concern in some situations, and we have to be aware of that. The physical space. Does a student even have a quiet space they can learn from? Are they doing this at the kitchen table of their family home? Do they not have a comfortable space to do this in? Again, a really important context to be aware of. And then, of course, is accessibility. And accessibility is always an issue in terms of being able to have accommodations that we need to worry about, issues with that students may have either with being able to see content, hear content, etc. Now, the last important context, and go ahead and advance there, Carolyn, the last important context, which is really critical, is the instructor context. We, at the beginning of June here, have 3 months before things go live in September. So time is really an important issue. Like, how much time do you have to devote to the design that you're going to do? What choices are you going to make in order to make sure that you're able to deliver the kind of course that you're looking for? So time is a really critical issue where you might have 3 courses you're preparing for the fall, and you're going to have to make some tough choices. The number of courses that you have to adapt, and of course, your internet service and bandwidth. Do you have the bandwidth from home? Are you sharing it with 5 other people in your house? When you're teaching, are you able to be alone to do your teaching? Do you have people running into the middle of it? I'm kind of thinking at any moment of this webinar, my phone might go off, my home phone, and I realize I didn't unplug it. And I'm going to have to remember next time to unplug my phone to make sure that downstairs here where I've got an office, that it doesn't distract. And the last is the physical space. One of the things you'll notice is that we're not really in Arts 150, this great active learning classroom at McGill. We're using a virtual background because I don't particularly want everybody to see what's going on in my basement behind me, and I'm not sure everybody wants to in their office, and so that's something to keep in mind.
And I think we can point out, Adam, that we're both in Arts 150, but only virtually. We're actually not in the same physical space right now.
Exactly. And I think this sort of is our indication of where we'd really like to be, but in fact, we are not going to be at the moment. We're just going to keep that virtual background going. Again, I could be underwater, but I thought, being in a classroom was a better message. All right, so let's continue to our next thought on student engagement.
Sorry, Adam, just before
Yeah.
you get to student engagement, I'm going to ask Jenny if you can put the link to the library blog post with the images for Zoom backgrounds. So in case people want to have McGill scenes as their backgrounds, they'll be able to access some images.
It's a great idea.
So we'll go to the next slide.
Yeah, and people, you can take a picture of your own office and easily do that as a background. So the thing that we need to talk about when it comes to student engagement, if we advance on that animation, is the 3 sort of concepts around student engagement and the framework that they come from. So this is an old framework from the 70s about thinking about student engagement, and it's been adapted over the years, and there's going to be some links at the end of this to the articles by Anderson and others that have kind of adapted this to the remote learning framework. But it basically looks at 3 different things. The first is, how are my students going to interact with course content and not just receive it, but actually apply it? How are they going to take that course content and make it meaningful to them? Access to particular materials. Are they going to have recordings that they're going to watch? Are there going to be other videos? Are you curating bibliographies to read? Are there things that they have to do each week that they need to do and have conversations about that later? That's really that first stage of the interacting with students interacting with content. And the second one here is, well, how are students interacting with each other? So is it just a stream of information coming from the instructor, or are there opportunities for things like breakout rooms, or if you're doing it live, or other things that we're going to talk about in a moment about how we can foster that kind of student-to-student interaction, even in a remote context? And the third one, which is also critical, is that student-instructor interaction. Is that, you know, we want to make sure that accessibility to the instructor, which is so key for learning, continues even in a remote delivery kind of scenario. So if we continue forward, one of the things that's really important is thinking about remote delivery activities. And we've come up with some suggestions of thinking about all of the activities you're doing in your course, either in a fixed activity kind of scenario or a flexible activity scenario. And the real difference between this is that the fixed activities is that students are participating together with you at the same time, okay? Flexible activities really shifts the responsibility to the students and has them doing things on their own schedule and their own time. Now, some of you might think that this is very similar to the synchronous, asynchronous kind of split, and in fact it is. But what's nice about thinking about fixed and flexible is that it actually connects to all sorts of different parts in the course context and course design, not just, let's say, discussions or face-to-face conferencing. And so I think the best way to talk about that is look at a couple of key examples. So if we move forward to our examples on the next slide about examples of our fixed and flexible activities.
Well, hold on, Adam, I'm going to interrupt you because we've got something else on the slide here. So there are actually a couple of important points to highlight regarding fixed and flexible activities. We've got a plus sign there. You might consider doing a combination of the two. So you don't have to do everything in fixed time. You don't have to do everything in flexible time. A combination of the two might be the route to go. And then we have another, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying, and exactly. And I think that combination is critical when you look at all the different pieces and parts. And the nice thing about combinations is that you can do those combinations where you're either combining a live activity, like let's say a Zoom meeting like this, and things like polling with a survey or something that you're going to do in my courses later. That's really much more flexible and allows students to do it on their own time.
Well, so you raise a good point there. If you don't mind, I'm just going to interject. Sure. So it could be that not all your students will be able to participate in fixed activities. So if you wanted to do a poll in a fixed activity, you could also have a parallel type of poll in a flexible activity. So you could have a survey in my courses, which would be a flexible activity, to sort of parallel the two so that students who can't participate at the fixed time can still participate, but they would be doing it in flexible time. So that's just something to think about, that you can run them parallel if you feel it's appropriate in your course context. And every course is going to be different, so people are going to have to make decisions.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the key messages throughout today, is that we really need you to start thinking and planning around those decisions about what do you want to make fixed and what do you want to make flexible. And I think that's a really important point, that, you know, all of one or all of the other is really not going to work. It's going to have to be that combination where you're making the best use of the context, how much time you have, what you can work on, what you can do, what should be fixed and what should be flexible. So if we go to the example slide, I think you'll see a little bit more concrete examples here, talking about what are some examples of fixed and flexible kind of activities. So the nice thing about thinking about fixed and flexible is that it really is something you can transfer across your entire course design process. So for example, fixed and flexible content. Well, this one's a little bit easier to manage because, well, fixed content makes sense, is that if you're doing a live lecture or if you're doing a presentation that's live, well, guess what? It's fixed. But what's interesting is that if you record that session and make it available later to watch, that then suddenly makes it flexible. And that's a really nice thing to think about. Is not to say that they're exactly the same thing. The live session may have some interaction points that you have to think about that are not necessarily going to be there if you just record it, but it allows that option to have that both fixed activity and flexible activity to be able to do that. Panel discussions, guest speakers that you're doing in a fixed sort of content way, but there's also a lot of flexible options. So you don't have to actually do a live session. You could actually fire up Zoom, make a recording, and have students watch it and not do it live at all. And that allows you to have a real flexible activity that's related to your content. Could be a demonstration. You could go outside with your cell phone and record something. You could go into your lab and record an activity. You could go to your kitchen and mix up sourdough and talk about a microbiology experiment that you might be growing in your fridge. These are all sorts of things that you can do to create flexible content. And of course,
yeah, you're not making those up, Adam. Those are real.
No, exactly. And in fact, actually, that sourdough one is one of my favorites, where we actually have instructors that are using home-based recipes in their kitchen to talk about microbiology experiments, which I don't know if you see my fridge, but I'm sure there are microbiology experiments actively going on in my own fridge.
Too much information.
Exactly. Well, you can't help it. You've got to have some personal information, and it's got to be an interesting discussion whenever you're doing something live and something fixed, as we're doing now. The last thing, of course, in flexible content that's important to think about is course readings, something we've always done, making those readings available, contacting your liaison librarian and getting all of those DOIs or those links to articles made for you in Pages that are integrated in my courses, making links not just to readings, but great TED Talks that are related, other content that you can curate, etc. The second
maybe Jenny can put the library link in the chat now, link to liaison librarians.
I'd be glad to. And just while I have a moment, there are a number of questions coming up in the chat about contact hours and expectations and how that relates to fixed and flexible activities. So for instance, is 39 hours a requirement for a typical 3-credit course? I'm hoping you can speak to that while I'm typing in the liaison librarian link there.
Sure.
And Jenny, you can also put in the link to the information about contact hours, because we have information on the web.
That's Absolutely. It, exactly. I mean, Carolyn, do you want to summarize that fast before we move on about the contact hours?
No.
Oh, all right.
I'd like you to summarize that quickly.
I mean, I think the idea of contact hours is that we need to carve up the hours in different ways and think of it as, if we look at total contact hours, the idea of 1 credit for 39 hours has been something that has carried from the past forward. In other words, the idea is that we're not necessarily changing the amount of contact hours that we've had from the past to the current. What we're looking at is restructuring them. So some might be flexible, some might be fixed. You might not have 3 one-hour sessions of fixed live lectures per week. That may not make sense. There is no specific requirement that is saying you must have 3 one-hour fixed sessions. That's not how it works. It's really set up where you get to make those decisions about what's most appropriate for your course, keeping in mind the links that we're providing there in the chat, so that people are able to look at making sure the total hours is not more than what you'd expect. And that's an important piece to think about too with students, is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that the learning is happening, okay? And it's about learning hours more than it really is that contact hours specifically.
So I will add to that, Adam, actually. So you misspoke, and we have a correction in the chat. So 1 credit is 13 hours, 3 credits, 39 hours. But as you say, we need to be thinking big picture, the whole. So not just the 39 contact hours, we want to be thinking about all the time that students spend outside class time, outside those 39 hours as well. And that's the larger whole that we want to carve up and work with. So Jenny, well, I don't remember the exact number, but Jenny's going to find the link, and it's a larger number that we're actually working with. So we're going beyond the 39, and we're dividing that larger number into what we want as fixed and flexible. And a frequently asked question is, well, how do we decide what to do? There is no one answer. So that's going to be something that you reflect on and decide on according to your learning outcomes and the context of your course.
And I think the context is really important. Yeah, and that context is really critical, because there are faculties that have some specific requirements, and that's something you need to address with your own faculty. There are guidelines across the university, but different faculties are suggesting and a number of different things. That's an important thing to keep in mind. And this is going to be one of the complex scenarios that you're going to have to look at going forward. What are you going to decide within your context, within your course, within your faculty? So I think this is a key thing that we have to keep in mind to make sure that people are aware what each of their faculties are doing. And I think that's an important piece to think about, that, Tamara and others are pointing out in the chat, that different faculties are suggesting different things. However, the overall structure that's there in the links that we provided provides some clear guidelines about the overall amount of hours that we're talking about. And I think Lucy said 135 or something.
And Laura, our director of TLS, Laura Weiner, also put 135 in the chat. So thank you both for that.
Yeah. So let's not get too derailed on the hours. I think that's something you're going to have to look at moving forward. I do want to point out a couple of other important things about differences between fixed and flexible. Under interaction, a good example of fixed interactions are polling, group or collaboration that's at a specific time. These are the types of interactions, Q&A, ask and answer. These are types of things that are going to be fixed interaction points within your course. And then of course we've got with flexible, the idea of discussion forums, group work that's occurring, let's say in online forums where there's a back and forth and you don't have to be there at that moment, at that time. And we can't stress enough how important the issue around time zones really are with students, that, you know, we have to minimize some of those fixed connections, because it might be 3 o'clock in the morning for some of the students in our courses. And of course on assessments, you know, this is where the fixed and flexible become really helpful as opposed to things that asynchronous and synchronous. The nice thing about fixed and flexible assessments is that we might have some fixed assessments. There might be an online exam, there might be an oral presentation that students are doing live. Again, those are possible. Be careful again with the structure and content of those. And then of course there's also the flexible assessments where it might be a take-home exam, there might be essays, you might be using the assignment tools, recorded presentations that students are doing. And all of these three things in terms of content, interaction, and assessment are exactly what our next webinars are really focusing on, doing a bit more of a deep dive in each one of these to look at supporting you in making the right decisions. The other things I want to mention too is, and there are some comments about how to share or not share. I think we have to be aware that a lot of those are going to be addressed in those specific webinars, for example, the content webinar, and that, you know, My Courses does a great job of managing all of this. And this is something to keep in mind. So if we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about our last two slides before we start to get to wrapping up and opening up for more questions, if we can address those, is talking about some of the benefits and drawbacks related to some of these fixed and flexible activities. So if we talk about live activities, I think this is something that we've alluded to already, is that, you know, some of the things for instructors, the big benefits is that live is often easier for people to adjust to. So in other words, if you did your session before in a classroom, it's sometimes easier to keep to wrap your brain around the idea of just doing it live in the same way. The nice thing is you can still record it, you can make it available afterwards, and it is a good opportunity to interact live with students. And you know, one of the things that's really great about teaching is interacting live with people, and it's an important part of that. Of course, one of the challenges with those things is that it requires a lot of management of some of the technology. You do have to be aware of how to use Zoom, and you may have to level up your skills to make sure you're able to have the kind of interaction you want to have. You may require some help with that delivery. You may need a TA to work with you, but we again have a lot of webinars that are in place to be able to support leveling up those skills. And it may be challenging to respond to all the questions. You'll notice here, this is a great example. We've got 355 people in this room at the same time. There are questions flying by that I can't possibly manage at the same time. I'm keeping an eye on them, but it's really hard to address them one-on-one. And that's why we're going to stop in about 5 minutes, and we're going to actually open it up and try and address some of those questions that Jenny's been collating, as well as looking at those questions live. Now,
that said, Adam, I just want to interrupt for a second. We did try to create an appropriate expectation at the beginning, and we understand that some people arrived late, but we did say at the beginning that we will not be responding in the chat because of the volume of questions. So that's just something to keep in mind with your students as well. If you have a large class or even a small class, if you're not prepared to answer questions as they scroll through the chat, just let people know, just let the students know, so that they don't have an expectation that's not going to be met.
Exactly. And you can always turn off the chat and then turn it on at appropriate times as well. That's another option that you always have in Zoom as an example.
And we chose not to do that. We let the chat stay open because we felt that participants could also communicate with each other and respond to each other's questions. But exactly. We had said we were not going to respond.
So the second thing I just wanted to mention too is there are a lot of benefits for fixed activities for students. Students can ask questions, and it's really important to be able to ask a question right at the moment where there's some confusion in order to clear things up. And it's also an opportunity for them to interact with their peers. You know, one of the things that we have to worry about is isolation in this kind of remote learning scenario. And when students get to class, they feel like they're connected. Of course, the challenge is that time zones and schedules are a real issue. There may be issues with the technology. They may have a problem. They can't connect. They can't do this. They can't do that. And that's one of the problems with all of this, is that everything is mediated with technology now. There is no way around it. And I think this is something where we have to be aware of those issues and make sure that we're able to incorporate them as best we can. And we can't stress enough practice. If you're unclear about using Zoom, you've got to practice it, and you got to practice it with your, friends, with your colleagues, with your children, with anybody who's interested. Colleagues are a great opportunity, and we'll talk about some opportunities moving forward with that. Okay, so let's move to the next one. When it talks about flexible. So flexible, again, we have a whole bunch of benefits for flexible activities for instructors, where the idea of time, delivery, and place. So you can structure your course. You have a lot more freedom, a lot more time to do things at different stages. Do this and then do this and then do this. Take time for reflection in between. It spreads out a lot of those learning opportunities. There's more tools available for you. A lot of people are talking about tools and how to. McGill has all the tools that we need. We've got them all, and they're all there, and they're just waiting for people to be able to discover them and use them in their courses. There's a flexibility in development delivery. Of course, then the challenges is that you do need to know how to use some of the technologies to be able to move forward. So you need to be able to fire up Zoom and do a recording. How do you get that recording to students? How do you set up the discussion tool? How do you create an assignment? Are you choosing the right assignment or a quiz tool in that process? And then, of course, with students, some of the big benefits is that students can engage in flexible activities on their schedule. And control is really important in this kind of stage. We don't know what kind of stress students are undergoing. And, one of the great examples of what this kind of teaching, this is trauma-informed teaching. There's a lot of trauma going on, with students and instructors. And we have to be aware of that trauma, and we have to understand that everybody is experiencing this whole pandemic differently. And we have to make sure that we're able to account for that. And that's where flexible activities are really helpful, because it gives students an opportunity to do it on their own schedules, and also gives them time to reflect and review that process going forward. Students also can have issues with viewing videos, which is always a challenge. And one of the things about flexible and fixed activities is that, taking, for example, a full 90-minute class and uploading it can be challenging, and it's hard to work with. And I think we have to think about breaking things up into more manageable chunks and thinking about ways to do that are going to be helpful. So I think, we're coming up on near the end of our time of our content, but I think we want to wrap this up and talk about our next steps and look at it for questions. So, one of the things that we really want to keep in mind is that it's the fixed and flexible part of this is really critical. And you really need to spend time at the planning stage thinking about your course as, the whole time that you have from September to December, and what's going to be fixed, what's going to be flexible, and then that gives you an idea of what you need to learn. Because by starting with those points and starting to say, I really want to do more flexible assessments, and to do that, what I'm going to really want to do is I'm going to do some weekly quizzes. Okay, that means I really need to think about the leveling up my skills around using my course's assessments. Well, guess what? That's where we're going to help you. So I'm going to get to that in a second. Other things you need to think about is the actual time, even when you're doing a fixed activity. For example, a 1-hour class that you might have. There are things where you should think about breaking it up. What we don't want to do is, I don't know if you've ever seen, is, having people listen to one person talk for 60 minutes is going to be very, very, very difficult. It's much more difficult online to do that. It's not recommended in any scenario. And the best thing to do is think about breaking it up. So doing maybe a 10-minute overview, having a poll. Doing another 10 minutes, maybe doing a breakout session, trying to intermix those kind of content and activities as much as possible.
So maybe Jenny, you can add to the chat the link to the example of the breakdown of a Zoom session, the example breakdown of a Zoom session, which is on the TLS website. And maybe you could add that. Yeah. Sorry, Adam, go ahead.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we just want to point out sort of what the next steps are. And I think this is really, really critical, is that we basically created a curriculum for you. Okay, you can decide, and it's all, it's a both combination of fixed and flexible, as you will see. These are fixed webinars in terms of time. However, they're all recorded, so they're flexible so that you can watch them on your own schedule, either if you want to rewatch them or if you want to access them later, or you can't make them to the time that we've got. And what's really important about these sessions is the top two, which talk about the planning of remote delivery, and the second one, which is going to be on Thursday, which we're starting, which is talking about designing assessments. And it's really the planning of the design around those assessments and what you want to do for remote delivery. But then you'll notice the next next 4 after that, preparing content, promoting student interaction and engagement, creating online assessment with my courses, managing your course. These are all webinars that are follow-ups that you can take as well, that go over the things that you need to really know and get you oriented around making sure that you're able to have some practice afterwards. There are certain sub-webinars that you might see underneath here. So for example, under promoting student interaction and engagement, we have 2 sub-webinars that are follow-ups even from that webinar that talk about getting started with polling. Because if you're not using polling and you really want to get into polling with your students, we have a tool. We've always had this tool. It still works in a remote scenario. It's something you can use. And of course, the second one there, which is engaging your students online with Zoom and really leveling up your Zoom skills. The others are there as well. Jenny's posted the link in the chat, and it's definitely something to look at in terms of signing up for those as soon as possible. One of the nice things is we don't actually have a cap on those. We can have as many people as we want. I would urge you to do that as soon as possible and look for that. There are 28 sessions over the next 4 weeks in terms of time with all of these online, and I'm sure you'll be able to find a time for you to connect with us. And then of course, from the webinars, there's all sorts of documentation online on how to do everything.
Okay, well, maybe we can actually go to some of that.
Sure. Yeah, let's do that.
And I just want to point out, you mentioned 28 sessions. They're not 28 unique sessions. We're repeating because we're assuming that not everybody's available at the same time.
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
So Adam mentioned documentation. We actually have homework for you. So before the next webinar on assessment strategies, we're hoping that you're going to have time to take a look at this document, Adapting Your Course for Remote Teaching. It's available on our website. The URLs are here. And this is a document that offers a number of questions for you to consider. It addresses what we've talked about today, and we've included many other questions for you to consider as you think about adapting your course for the remote context. In fact, on the front page of that document, we do have a link to information about credit hours. People were asking about that before. And we have a second document available called Adapting Your Assessment Strategies for Remote Teaching. You might want to take a look at that in advance of the next webinar as well. And we've put some examples of evaluation schemes on the web. They're not in the resource documents, but they're on the web in case you need inspiration. And I know from my years teaching, sometimes I really benefited from seeing examples and getting inspiration from what other people have done. So we're hoping you can find something there that will get you going with your planning. And we have some additional homework for you. Next steps. Are you new to my courses or do you need a refresher? So there is a self-paced tutorial available for you called My Courses Essentials. Everybody who is assigned to teach a course should have access to this tutorial. If you don't, you can contact IT support. But what we'd like to point out here, this 67, this refers to activity in the discussion forum. And this is a place where you can post questions about my courses. It's a moderated discussion forum, so there will be answers for you. So we encourage you to take a look at that. And if you do have my courses questions, you can post them there. So we're toward the end. We do want to take some questions, but we also want to know from you, what's your most important takeaway from today's session? And just like to say that this provides us with some feedback from you, but at the same time, it might raise your awareness of the important points that you want to leave with. And we like to end our webinars with this because it's a good way to model what you might do with your own students in class. It's something simple that you can do, gives you feedback, and it raises students' awareness of what their takeaways are. So we're going to ask you to put that in the chat. Just type in what your most important takeaway is from today's session. And I think while people are doing that, we might be able to look at some questions. Jenny, Absolutely. Is there anything?
Yes, so I'm happy to bring up a few questions that have been posed over the course of the last little while. I'm just going to my notes here. So instructors seem really intrigued by this idea of fixed and flexible approaches. And I know that we shared some samples. You shared some samples in the slides of what those could involve. Instructors are wondering how to make those decisions and, you know, considering things like time zones and also expectations, you know, recognizing that people are often accustomed to having that sort of critical mass of people in and at the same time, wondering for suggestions on how to approach that.
Okay, so that's what I mentioned earlier. That's one of the frequently asked questions. How does one make that decision? And there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. We would suggest you go back to your learning outcomes. And that's why we wanted to work with that course design framework and use it for adapting one's course, because ultimately it's the learning outcomes that should be driving the decisions you make about how you set up your course. That's how we do it when we're not in a remote context. And the sound pedagogy still applies in the remote context. So you'll have to make some decisions, and maybe you're going to try things out, but there isn't just like a recipe like do 50% this, do 50% that. No, we would encourage you to take a close look at the outcomes and say, well, if I want my students to do this, are they going to be able to achieve it by doing it in fixed time, or will they be able to do it doing it in flexible time, or do I need a combination of both? So we would suggest going back to the learning outcomes and using those to guide the decision making.
And one of the things that I want to add that's really interesting here as well is that, you know, none of really what we're talking about is new, right? I mean, what we're doing is we're adapting what we know what's good about good course design to a new context. And I think it's the context that's really the issue. And that's the new part, is suddenly the context has changed. But our learning outcomes, if we have a course, are probably very similar to what we may have had in the past. What we're looking for is how we might do it is going to start to differentiate. And that's where, you know, while course design and the concepts around good design are the same, how we're applying it suddenly changes. And I think that that's one of the interesting questions. I see a lot of questions that have come up, and I just was sort of scanning the chat, that there's some concern and some fear about new tools and new things to learn. But again, you know, we're presenting a whole bunch of different options for you. And I think, you know, what we want you to do is to really think about, you can make the tough decision to decide what you want to do. And I think that there are so many good tools out there. McGill has so many different options and availability for you, that if you have an idea about what you want to do, it can most likely be implemented. So even with Zoom, which is a great example of, there is so much that Zoom can do that with a little bit of tinkering, a little bit of reading, and a look around a lot of the how-to tutorials, you can really level up your skills. You know, and I urge you to look at what's online. There is a ton of how-to information about what to do. And even Zoom has daily webinars for anybody on the planet who wants to just learn how to use the tool. So these are things that are really important to keep in mind moving forward.
I'd also like to add on to Adam's point in terms of thinking about different ways that you can get information. And one of the things that I so appreciate about these webinars is seeing the richness in the chat discussion of suggestions that you are offering to colleagues. So on that point, one of the other questions that had come up was, how do we figure out where students are in terms of time zones? And two of the suggestions that so attendees at this webinar contributed are either using a Microsoft Forms ahead of time and doing a very short survey that can be shared with students who have already registered for your course, or potentially using that polling tool that we sampled at the very beginning of the webinar once students are at the very start of the course. So just thinking about how we can use occasions like this to share ideas, and that there's so much that you have to share from your own experience that could be very helpful for colleagues. So thank you for those ideas.
And we can add another tool to that. My Courses has a survey tool as well.
Yep,
so there are different options for conducting that survey.
And, you know, one of the things you can do is you can also, there's the ability to open your course early if you wish. Caveat, make sure that you have things hidden that you want hidden, so students aren't looking at things they aren't supposed to. But you can even open your course a little bit early if you want. That's another option. The survey tools are another option. I think it's one of the important things as well is with the, you know, the message we're giving you is very similar to what you would give to your students. You know, practice the technology, practice what you're doing, try it out on somebody. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting with Zoom is a great example is that a lot of people have started to have practice because this is actually how they're interacting with their families. So if you haven't on the weekend had virtual drinks with a group of friends with Zoom, try it. It's a great opportunity to play with Zoom. And these are things that are really going to be important to get you comfortable with trying some of this on the fly. You can obviously see that, you know, large numbers of people, 300 plus, take a lot of effort to manage, and there's a lot of things there. You're going to need to draw on your TAs. You're going to need to look for help. And the last thing with a lot of the comments in the chat is that there's a great deal of help available. Somebody said, if we have a problem, what do we do? Well, guess what? You can call IT support. There's a remote teaching emergency number that's part of that. It's the regular phone number, and you can actually choose, I need emergency help for remote teaching, and somebody will help you. Now, they may not be able to help you while you're live in that class at the moment, but it's about as close as we can get to getting help to you as quickly as possible. So all of the existing help structures at the university are there. Emailing IT for IT support, it'll get escalated to the right people, contacting anybody locally like your liaison librarians, the Office of Student with Disabilities, all of those same resources all exist for you moving forward.
Okay, so I just want to point out, we're at 12:46. We can stay on for another couple of minutes. We do have a hand up from Amar. So Amar, if you'd like to, I'll just click there. I'll unmute you. And Amar, you wanted to ask something?
Yes, there is one thing we need to maybe look at. We need to look into the hardware. It's not only have to use Zoom. Some people, they're really using doc cams, so they use tablets. So we need maybe some guidance in selecting those tools, or maybe including them in the way we teach. So I heard some people, they purchase their own doc cams and they are starting to teach the same way in the class, but using those doc cams to present to their students. So maybe we need some guidance in selecting which tools that hardware to include in our future online teaching.
So I'll just mute you again, Amar, and I think Adam can speak to that.
That's a really great question, and that's actually something that's in the Zoom session that talks about whiteboarding and doing some things that you might want to do. I can tell you that many of us have a device that's sitting right here, our phones, that you can plop here, make it your own document camera, connect to your laptop and go. Those are some things that we're going to make recommendations, as well as there are groups at the university looking at the ability to kind of loan out some of these tools to everybody that might want them, keeping in mind that, so does everybody else want them. So there's distribution shortages on some of these things that are important to think about. If you have, for example, a tablet, you can connect it to Zoom and do live transcribing. If you have a phone, as an example, you can plop it right here and draw underneath, and the camera can connect as well. Some of those are going to be dealt with in the Zoom sessions. I think those are great ideas. You're absolutely right that we do have a physical kind of space we may wish to connect with, but also keep in mind that's where flexible activities are particularly helpful. Maybe you need to do a demo. Well, you can take your phone and go do a chemistry demonstration that in your kitchen, or maybe you need to go to campus and you get approvals to be able to do something where you're doing a recording of something in a lab that you want to make available afterwards. So again, those all have to be thought about in terms of fixed and flexible and what's possible and what's not. A great question.
So I think we're going to wrap things up now, and thank everybody for joining us today. It was great to see so many people here, and we have another webinar later this week, so please register, join us for that. This recording will be on the web later this week. Check out the resource documents and take a look at My Courses Essentials. Adam, any closing words?
No, once again, thank you for engaging, and look forward to seeing you in other sessions, and please go and register. There's lots of space available.
Jenny, thanks very much for putting all those links in the chat. People have been commenting on them, so appreciate that, and we'll sign off now. Thank you very much.